Happy Tuesday, everybody. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Just want to give everybody a chance to get in. Jim, the snow's still going well in Portland?
Well, we have snow on the roads and the city's pretty locked down, so it's
Yeah,
not going to really thaw until tomorrow.
there you go. All right, let's give it just a few more minutes. Hope everybody had a nice break celebrating Dr. King's Day. All right. Go ahead and put us on screen, Jim, and we'll get started here in just a quick second. We've got a few more people coming in, and then we'll get started. All right. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hello, and welcome to our webinar. It's really exciting. This is one of, I think, our biggest webinars to date. One of the things we try to do at Blameless is really just give back to the community. We've been lucky enough to have a lot of operational experiences in various companies. And, one of the things we really like doing is giving it back to the community. And so today's webinar is going to be all around helping you drive operational excellence, in technology. I'm Ken Gravanovic, COO of Blameless. And in prior roles, I worked together with both Jim and Lee over at New Relic. I also ran operations over at Cox Automotive. Maybe you've heard of Kelly Blue Book, Auto Trader, some of the other brands. I know in some cases, 5-minute outage might be $52 million. So it was a big deal if you had outages, and web.com and various other startups. So glad to be here with everybody. During the webinar, make sure if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat now. We'll capture them either as we go or at the end of the session. And we'll share some nice posts in there for you, including an exclusive white paper that just came out. So more with that soon. But before we do that, let me introduce the two other people I have with me. Jim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then maybe you could turn it over to Lee.
Yeah, hey everybody, good morning. My name is Jim Gochi, CEO of Blameless. Prior to Blameless, like Ken said, spent a lot of time at New Relic, and then further back in my career, first job out of college was at Apple, and so things were a little bit different. The internet wasn't in existence at that point, although it was very close. But very happy to be here at Blameless. Hugely interested in site reliability and how that impacts organizations' ability to build and develop and ship and maintain software over the internet. Lee, over to you.
Hi. My name's Lee Atchison. I'm a cloud architect and an author. I've worked in senior leadership positions at Amazon, at AWS, and at New Relic as well, which is where I work with Jim and Ken. I've written several books, including O'Reilly Media's Architecting for Scale, and I finished a book last year with my good friend Ken here on Business Breakthrough 3.0. And let's see, currently I provide consulting and advising services, but I'm also the chief reliability officer at Blameless.
Great. Well, thanks. And when we thought about bringing Lee on, we think it's really important. And so many companies, it's interesting. Like you get an opportunity, maybe you're an SRE and you're creating an SRE practice at a new company. How do you do that? How, it's not just the technology piece, that people process part. Like how do you do that? And sharing best practices, one of the things that we really try to do, and we're investing in more content with people to share so that they kind of know, hey, if you land there, or maybe you're trying to transform it, maybe it's a place that had too many outages, things weren't quite getting resolved. How do we do that? We've actually even built some tools, because one of the things a lot of people ask us is, how do you kind of get an idea, where am I in that kind of curve of reliability? We've actually built a reliability assessment tool. It's actually free. You go to the website. Aaron, maybe if you could just post that in the Slack for anybody that's interested. And again, that's a tool that we've given there. But let's go ahead and kick off. one of the things people first ask is kind of like, what are the stages of an incident, just at the very, very highest level? And, typically it's detection, response, mitigation, diagnosis, repair, analysis, and then kind of continuous learning. And from my experience, I think that that's true. And those are the commonly known six stages. But I also think, I don't know if you call it a stage, but something I think people need to talk about is communication. Because as you go through those stages, you think about each of those stages, communication's a really, really important part. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But, Jim, I thought when we put together this webinar, we've been through so many different experiences. Maybe if you could share a couple of experiences, from New Relic and, when you think about those stages and, because I know at New Relic, we had like 2 billion events per minute coming in. It's a big deal when you basically monitor the internet to make sure it works, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, reliability is crucial, and I think that's so. I think that's when I really started to appreciate more formalized reliability practice. Is you just realize how much is on the line, and at New Relic, a lot of times the data that we collected was the most valuable to companies when they were having a problem. So it's the classic thing, like if customers having a problem and they're trying to use that data to troubleshoot, diagnose what's happening, like that data's got to be super reliable. And reliability was a challenge because we were experiencing high growth. And so if you're not experiencing high growth, it's a little easier to stay on top of things. But if you're experiencing high growth, it's a constant sort of build features, but then something breaks, and maybe the marketing team ran an ad campaign or something, and so you're overwhelmed with interest, or the classic thing like Super Bowl, or maybe it's holiday shopping season, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, things like that, right? So I do feel like at New Relic, we kind of had a front row seat, and I would say in the early years we were pretty naive about reliability. So the company launched in 2008, and it really wasn't until 2016 that Google wrote the SRE book and really started to codify this concept of holistic site reliability. So I feel like we backed into a lot of it ourselves. And we didn't necessarily know like these are the 7 categories and this and this and this, but we certainly did learn a lot along the way. And one of the reasons I came here to Blameless is I really, as an executive leader over a large software development team, I came to fully appreciate how a really formal reliability practice just not only really helped provide a better customer experience, but it also allowed my teams to have better velocity with features. Because if you did more things proactively, then you'd have less reliability issues on the back end. And reliability issues are just like an iceberg. There's what you see, and then there's all that stuff that goes on that you don't see. So you mentioned the different stages in communications as an example. So for example, if you don't communicate well, what does that really cost you? That can be difficult to see in the moment, but poor communications, whether it's poor internal communications with, other employees at the company, or whether it's poor communications outside with customers, that has a huge cost, right? And I think the other thing to consider that, in addition to those things, like you said, detection and mitigation, all that is, who are the stakeholders that are really along for the ride whenever there's an incident. And there's obviously the customer impacted, but if you just look even within inside your company, who are the other groups, who are the other stakeholders that tend to be impacted as well? So certainly like a customer support team, you're just going to get tickets filed. You may have a sales team that's trying to close out the quarter, and then there was an outage, and that's going to impact anybody who's taking a look at your product and maybe wants to purchase. Renewals. Maybe there's a really tricky renewal coming up, and it's a competitive renewal because the customer was on the fence and now there's an outage. And so you think about like anybody who's impacted, and certainly our CEO at New Relic would get very interested when there was major outages, clearly, and same here with Blameless. I'm very interested anytime we have an issue. You got to understand all your stakeholders and how you're going to manage them. So that's why thinking very holistically, I think that was the overarching thing I learned first, like having a very holistic notion of a reliability practice really, really helped.
Makes sense. I've got some thoughts on that, but Lee, maybe you've got some experiences you could share from,
Yeah,
AWS or Amazon that might be interesting for everyone.
yeah, absolutely. So, I think the thing that I've observed, and certainly isn't a surprise to anyone, is the whole process of incident management has become a much more mature process over the decades, right? So when I started my career and I was working at HP, incident management was a customer support agent who happened to see the same sort of problem coming from customers multiple times and deciding, hey, I better call my friend over in the dev team to see if they know anything about this and see if they want to deal with it. And it's who you knew and those connections is the only way of communication for incident management. And certainly by the time I got to Amazon, there was much more formalized processes for observability and identifying when incidents occurred and all that sort of stuff. But still, it ultimately boiled down to incident management was getting 40 people on a phone call and having someone coordinate, all of the mics running in different directions to manage the phone call. And it really wasn't until some of the work that Jim put in really at New Relic that you started to see formalized process of managing the incident itself. How do we use tools like Slack to coordinate the response? How do we coordinate what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, and how do we coordinate the communication to some of the stakeholders you were talking about? Whether they're the sales lead for a critical deal that's about to close that can't because there's an incident, or management, or whoever it is. The outside stakeholders still care about what's going on, and some of those processes start getting matured. So I think we've seen a huge change since the early days of Amazon and certainly the days of HP for how we manage these sorts of incidents. And I think the future is really bright for being able to manage effectively and create systems that are scalable for managing scalable outages that are occurring nowadays. Ken?
Makes sense. I think it might be good for us to hit a little about culture because I know a lot of times when I talk to, customers here or, in prior lives, at New Relic or Cox, how do you drive that transformation? Because, Jim and I met, I was a transformation agent at Cox. And so this is before the Google SRE book. I actually started embedding ops people and teaching them new skills into dev teams. I think
Yeah.
that's Jim actually the first time we had that conversation. So I thought maybe let's just talk a little bit about that. So, if you're kind of coming in and creating a new SRE practice or transforming a company, don't underestimate, as you go through like the first part, detection. Oftentimes it's uncomfortable because now there's visibility that your service, maybe it's up most of the time, but it's not up all the time because you've got New Relic, you've got Datadog, you've got some sort of tooling. So don't underestimate that part of creating a culture that it's okay if you have an incident, as long as we learn from it. I used to like to think, create when you would do the RCA process, like to call it a do not repeat plan. I think other people call it error correction plan. There's different ways to call it, but make sure that when there's detection, that's a good thing. Now we know before our customers are broken. That's matter of fact, that was one of my first questions when I was at Cox when I redid the RCA questions. Is I say, did our systems tell us that we had an issue? Or did our customers? And I think for all of you, if you go in there and if you're at a company, I think that's a really important thing to hit on first is detection is you want to make sure your systems tell us versus your customers, because that's where you might have intermittent issues that just cost your company a ton of money. That's a customer success call repeatedly. That's a sales complaint that says, oh, it happens, but I can't repeat it. So detection's super, super important. Response and getting the right people on the call. We've bought PagerDuty, we've bought Ops Genie. I think making sure that it's easy for the engineering team or the ops team to get the right people to the call. So you need to know who's upstream, downstream of each other. So that way you don't have, like 4 different issues that are all caused by the same thing. Make sure mitigation's fast. The diagnosis, I think run books, or if you haven't done that, a lot of times, have a repeatable process. Because as we know, I think I'd say 95% of all outages are usually because something changed. Maybe it's the marketing team placed the beat ad and forgot to tell you it was the Super Bowl or whatever else it might be. And then that last part, analysis and learning. And I think that's the part that's really hard too. So, that you need to think about in your organization, because it's okay, something happened and it's okay, somebody fixed it. But what did we learn from it? Do we really have a continuous learning process? Are we having an honest conversation, whether you use like the five whys or whatever else, to make sure we found the root cause? Because many times people stop the RCA process. Well, so and so did a bad query that scanned the whole database. There's the problem. No, that's not actually the problem. The problem is that type of bad query got into production, right? So that's, you need to kind of really go back into that piece. And the last part, I'm thinking like continuous learning, is make sure that whatever is learned, because it may be there's an action item for the marketing team to give the engineering team a heads up if they're going to buy a Super Bowl ad, right? Think about that continuous learning goes anywhere. Jim, I said a bunch of different things. Anything I missed, or maybe other thoughts in that?
I have a lot of thoughts on. You opened it with just talking about culture, and you identified some of the main things. It's really important to start with this. And culture, it's not what you say or it's not what you want. It's essentially what you're doing. So you can't, for example, say you have a culture of reliability if you don't do things to support that, right? So I think if for example, you have a problem in your organization related to any of these things that Ken mentioned, you've got to think very specifically, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to force an issue? So for example, if like, oh, developers don't seem to care, they just check in code that breaks the system. So that's kind of a problem that you've identified. Or maybe the issue is bigger around why are communications are so terrible. Developers never communicate during an outage. So you can talk all you want when you have a problem. You can pull people into a room. The question is like until you force with action, and then people learn that new behavior. And so you have like where you're trying to get the culture to, and then you need to basically through habit, you need to retrain people the way they work, what incentives that they have, and one of the things you mentioned, just making sure like there's transparency in without the blame, essentially, right? This is a huge thing. The FAA has been doing this forever with airplanes, but in terms of like when there is something major that breaks, it needs to be clear that we're focused on the problem and making sure it doesn't ever happen again. We're not focused on pointing a finger at somebody and saying like you messed up. There, often was somebody who messed up. There often was somebody at fault. And so, but that needs to be identified, but from a learning perspective, so that the mistake doesn't happen again. And creating this culture, and we've seen it within our own customers. So we've had customers tell us that before they got really serious about putting a tool in place, people would hide incidents. And I've also seen this in my career where, something bad happened and everyone's like, cover it up. Like we don't want, that to go up to management because we're going to get yelled at. And you really have to break free of that culturally. So again, everyone's in a different place. I think as you're thinking about reliability, we were pretty advanced by the end at New Relic, but we weren't advanced at the beginning. And just it took us a long time to work our way constantly. It's like, hey, this thing isn't going well. Yeah, it's not going well. Okay, well, what do we want to do about it? And I just think putting action against that is really how you affect that cultural change.
I totally agree. Lee, anything that popped in your mind?
Yeah, I always think of three things that are critical to a culture of reliability. You have to have observability that has to be ingrained in the culture. You have to have repeatability, and you have to have communications. Observability in your culture implies that not only are you collecting the data that helps you to understand how your application works, but the people that are involved in the process pay attention to the data, use the data, and make decisions based on that data. Then, communications, as I think Jim talked a lot about that, the blameless culture, the the ability to communicate. I've seen lots of companies that are good at sharing information, but not good at communicating. And it's the right information to the right people and making the information available to people who need to know it when they need to know it. It's a challenge that goes well beyond just, like I said, at Amazon, having a broadcast phone call and having everyone involved in the communications process. And the repeatability. You can identify trends and solve problems caused by trends and patterns in the past only if you handle the information and handle the request and handle the process of determining what's going on in a repeatable fashion using standardized processes. And only by using standardized processes can you be aware of what you're doing so you can do it again in the future.
Hey, Ken,
Yeah, go ahead.
I see we have a question that's also kind of related to this topic, so maybe we could kind
Go
of
ahead. Do you want to take
answer it
it?
right now. Yeah, so one of the attendees asked a question. Essentially, it's around how do you ensure that teams don't repeat an incident and basically learn from past mistakes, is kind of how I read the question from Schenker. And so what I would say is this is going to get really practical now. So if you're doing retrospectives and you're learning, okay, like, this is why this incident happened. You then need some formalized process, and Ken mentioned it, don't repeat. So you got to have this thing where it's like, okay, well, we have a rule. We never want to repeat an incident. And so during the retrospective, you identify, okay, these things, if we did these three pieces of work, this incident would never happen again. So whatever that incident was, there's essentially a fix that would ensure more or less that thing would never happen. Okay, so we call those follow-up actions. And really what you then need is you need buy-in from leadership to say, hey, whenever there's an incident and whenever there's follow-up actions, those go into the next sprint. And they would bump other work that was in the sprint. Okay, and this is why it needs leadership sign off, because leaders are typically driving functionality and features, leaders within a product management organization. And so if they don't give permission for things like this to go into the next sprint, then it won't happen. So again, assuming you're doing a retrospective, assuming that there were things identified, you need to make sure that there's buy-in to basically bump those things to the top. I would also add, I would make sure that it's communicated, because that'll be confidence building. So make sure it's communicated internally that, hey, these are the things that we learned from this outage, and the team is working on those things right now so that this outage, this class of outage will never happen again. I can tell you, if you're within a customer support organization or a sales team, you're going to be like, hey, that's great. They had an outage, they took it professionally, they identified what to fix, and they're fixing it. And then that buys you some air cover too, because it's like, well, hey, yeah, but that we were supposed to launch a feature next week. It's like, yeah, well, that's going to have to get delayed a week because we can't, because we've got to fix these issues right now. So again, it requires, call it organizational fortitude, but without a commitment to actually fixing the things, you're just going to keep, like, the thing is going to keep breaking again, and you're going to have repeat after repeat. And we've all seen it, like there's often parts of the code base where you just get repeated outages, and there's parts of the code base that are brittle, flaky, or just critical. And if you don't really stay consistent in fixing those issues when they happen, they will just keep happening.
Yeah, I want to jump in and just see if I can hit on a couple of things. Hopefully this will be kind of practical advice too. Is one thing, again, is it's really, really important that you get to the critical, actual thing that caused it. And, one of my favorite questions for, probably 10 plus years now is, given the same set of circumstances at the end of an RCA, you've got these list of action items. Given the same set of circumstances, if we would have done all of these things, would we still have had an outage? Now, there's always those rare ones that there's nothing you could have done. Some car hit an electrical pole and blew out the data, or something weird. But most of the time, if you ask that question and you look at it, and like, oh yeah, no, it would still happen because of this. I think that's a great way to make sure you're really getting to the root cause. Then the next part that you talk about enrichment is you need to have definitely an SLA process. So now you have these things for people to do. You need to track it, you need to measure it, you need to make it that progress visible so that kind of enforces the behavior and culture that you want. And then there's an SLA. This is a really important thing. It caused a really big outage. Well, that needs to get prioritized and get fixed really, really quickly. This other thing, it's a lower thing, maybe it takes a little better. And the other part, I'll say what's great if you do this right is, all of us here start off as engineers, right? One of the things that we know, especially if you have large enterprise systems, oftentimes some of the outages is cause of underinvestment in that particular technology, right? Maybe it's kind of in the KTLO, keep the lights on status, or there's minimal investment, or it needs severe refactoring. One of the things I've done historically very, very successfully is if you take that data when you're doing your annual, business analysis, it's a great tool also to say, hey, listen, we know that this system caused these many outages that cost this much money. And so when you're asking for that 5, 10 million, $2 million R&D investment or engineering investment to fix something, it's very data driven. The amount of times I've seen at very large companies where there's a major outage and afterwards the company invests a lot of money to quote fix it. But if you look back, maybe for the last 2 or 3 years, there was funding that was denied because it was funding being asked for without data. Um,
Yeah.
Lee, I didn't let you jump into any thoughts on.
Well, it's kind of a continuation of the data thought, but you know, the a lot of people don't like formalized processes. If they're going through a formal incident review afterwards, why do you want to do that? You fix the problem, you move on, you go from that. But if one of the big values, besides giving you things that keep you from repeating incidents from occurring, is it gives you reoccurring data. It gives you patterns that are repeatable, patterns that recur, allowing you to see trend analysis in data. So you talk about data. By doing the same thing and handling incidents and dealing with the responses the same way consistently, you'll be able to collect data and start finding your weak points in the product and finding the places that need more investment and finding where most of your incidents are coming from and be able to adjust as you go. So, you know, repeatability, you don't want incidents to repeat, you don't want problems to repeat. You do want the processes you use to repeat so that you can create this data and analyze these trends and know what's actually happening.
Hey
Great.
Ken, can I also chime in on this one?
Yeah.
Because I really liked what you said about providing the data. So I could, being someone who wrote code and took the pager in a small environment, it's like you don't need a lot of data. You just like the right thing happens. But then as an organization grows, I think now this is where the data becomes interesting. And I'll just give you an example. So, by the end of my tenure at New Relic, the team was the sort of product management engineering team was quite large. It was about 500. And people would come to me all the time saying, Jim, I need budget. I need budget for this. I need budget for that. We need to do this. We need to do that. So I was always dealing with a set of requests far larger than I had the budget for, we had the capacity to do, right? And so as a leader, you're always making trade-offs. It's like, okay, we're going to do this, and that you make the final decisions typically about where an organization spends its time and energy and money. And without a business case, I was always very skeptical. Skeptical because I knew as an engineer, there was parts of the code base I'd love to go rewrite because we didn't write it properly, or someone wrote it and then they left, and we discovered it really wasn't written very well. So there's always technical debt, there's always things to do, but the question is, like, from a business perspective, what's the most valuable to do? And so when it comes to reliability, if you don't show up with any data to your executive team, you're asking them to really take a guess or believe you at face value with no information. And that's really not a great situation to put your leadership team in. If you can go to your leadership team with the information, with a lot more detail, and then essentially that turns into a business justification, Ken, like you said, it's like, okay, well, Can we show the impact? Can we show what's been happening? This is where you can really make an effect. And I've seen people complain. It's like, well, my leadership team just doesn't want to invest in reliability. And I don't think that's actually really it. The leadership team isn't convinced that reliability is the proper investment, probably because enough information hasn't been provided. Unless there's like a major outage, Lee, like you said. Major outage, everybody blows up, and it's like, okay, great, now we're going to invest in it. It's like, no, that's not the right way to do it. Like it needs to be obvious and clear at all times. Where do you stand? How much is reliability impacting you, and should you be investing more in it?
I agree.
I think
And
it's
oh, go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say, I think it's worth going to that anonymous attendee question that just came up because I think the answer to this question is the same, really, as what you've just been saying, Jim. Let me read the question since not everyone can see it. It says, often the exact same scenario doesn't happen, but similar issues happen due to the same underlying, possibly cultural issues. How do you get teams to realize that the different issue is still the same? I think the answer is the broken record you can hear from us is data, right? You can demonstrate with data, even if this problem's over here, this problem's over here, this problem's over here, looking at the data and looking at the whole set of incidences holistically can help you identify common root causes. And even if the incidents are very different, when you do the 5 whys to get to the root cause and you find the root cause of all those incidents being the same, that's a great way, that's a great set of data that can be used to convince people of where you need to invest in order to solve the problems. Whether that's convincing the team, as this question implies, or as Jim was saying, convincing management.
We've got some more questions, but I just want to make one more comment on this because I think that was pretty spot on. One, it goes back to training, is, doing an RCA process is something that you can learn. Like we try to spend a lot of time, like I gave you that simple question, given the same set of circumstances, what do we need to do to have a different answer? Even though it sounds very basic, I've been in hundreds of RCAs from outages that cost 2 million to 50 million. Some low ones that cost us nothing too, of course. And a lot of people really just go at the surface. A lot of RCAs are more activity than outcome. If you know me, you know I'm a big outcome over activity person, which means what are we trying to accomplish? The RCA is actually a learning process. And so we really want to figure out maybe the whole root issue is we rushed the Q&A team because there wasn't good heads up for the engineering. And that's why the Q&A team messed the table scan and da 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 da. You really want to make sure that people are focused on learning that and they think about this as an interesting learning activity. The other part I'll just say is this does take some level of investment and focus. Jim, you and I were just talking to a new customer that's a global financial services company that had hired somebody, we'll say, from a major cloud provider to revamp their operational practices. And that's where that company probably made a decision. They probably had an outage and they said, we need to invest in the incident management process. Jim, when you invited me to Blameless last year, and I know that's when you came about a year or so ago, but that's the part that kind of excited probably us both is, part of it is just the incident management process in itself. You need tooling that kind of drives that consistency, communication, SLAs, dashboards. You obviously want a dashboard pumping out to not just your technology team, but how about the business leaders? So they have confidence and they understand the investment, because that's how you explain it. You explain that incident management is a focus, it's an investment, it's training. All right, final comments on this before we move on. Jim, Lee, anything else?
Well, we got another question also related, so let's take
Oh,
this. And this question is that this Ashwin doesn't see that teams are comfortable sharing data with each other, whether that's issues that came up and hey, we had a problem, or maybe the root cause. And it's usually because people are embarrassed, honestly, because something happened. And I think an organization left to its own devices, or call it a developer team or a developer left to their own devices, is usually not going to point out their failings. Hey everybody, I made a big mistake and this bad thing happened. It's not human nature, honestly. So this is actually quite an interesting topic. It's like human nature says, I want to, promote the good things that I do, and I want to hide the mistakes that I make. I mean, that's kind of just human nature. And so you really have to overcome that human nature if you really want to affect this cultural change that you've got. And if teams really don't want to talk and they don't want to share, you don't have the culture yet. The culture is not what you want. And I think Ashwin, you've identified this. It's like this is a problem. They don't want to share their issues, and you're right. Absolutely is a problem. And so what you need again, and just think about like cultural problem solving or organizational problem solving. What is it that you could do to get them to share this kind of stuff? What is it that you could kind of force in to do it? So for example, in any group setting where all the engineering teams are there, you could force an agenda item, say every week or two, where you just talk about all the outages, all the incidents, and what happened and what you're going to do about it. And there's no judgment or blame, or no one's pointing fingers. But then people see, oh, okay, wait a minute. If we have a problem, I'm not getting yelled at, but it is very public. And that's just enough pressure where it's like if the same team is getting up every week or every other week and having to basically say, hey, we had this problem again, then the other smart people are going to be like, well, why aren't you fixing it? And
Right.
so there's a natural course correction that would happen there.
Now, totally agree. When I was at Cox or as Cox Cable, one time I sat in, I was in the automotive division, but I sat in on the cable side. Is basically there were people that represented, even on the physical cable, all the different units across the United States, and they'd have to talk through any little outage that they have. Because again, you think about process to drive the right behavior. So totally agree with that. All right, let's move on because I know we've got 10 pretty cool questions. So do that. So really good conversation. I will just say that ROI calculator that Aaron posted earlier, a lot of people don't even understand the cost of an incident. There's the engineering time and there's the I couldn't sell thing time, but there's a huge cost to your entire organization. So once you can kind of, again, take data and numbers to explain it to people, it really makes a big difference in getting, the resources to invest in it in the time. Um, so let's move on to another, I think, a common topic, golden signals. Often people call the golden signals for SREs or latency, traffic errors, saturation, or sometimes people call it resource exhaustion. Those are common metrics to help gauge the health of the system. Jim, how have that kind of influenced you as you kind of matured that practice over there? And Lee, maybe I'd love to see if there's anything you have on AWS afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, we had the advantage of being an observability company at New Relic, and these are essentially the signals that you need to look at, and they're all important for different reasons, right? So, latency, obviously, if things are slow, that's essentially a big problem for customers. So you could technically be up, but let's say pages were taking 20 seconds to load. I mean, that's essentially being down for the most part. So latency's got to be looked at very carefully. Errors, this is the other one. It's like, hey, all systems are green, we're up. It's like, yeah, but the code is throwing errors and the pages aren't fully formed. And so essentially it's broken, because again, there's like, site reliability just isn't about uptime. It's also that the thing is responsive, right? And it's not just broken and throwing like a error into the browser. Or okay, oh no, we didn't have an error. Well, yeah, but you had a little graphic which suggested that thing couldn't load properly. So again, that's still kind of a broken user experience. And then saturation is critical because if you're just monitoring the server could look like it's doing fine, more or less responsive, it's running. But if you have far too much demand that's essentially queuing up, like in a web balancer or load balancer outside of the server, then the customer is having a terrible experience. You're just never measuring that because your systems are at saturation. And that's a really interesting topic because saturation is important. Obviously, you don't want to saturate your systems and run out of resource, but you also don't want to over provision And this is a really, another angle of site reliability engineering. It's like, what's the right size of infrastructure and the right size of cloud spend to match the demands on those systems? You don't want to, and I've seen teams do this. I've seen teams get burned by an outage. You go through the retrospective and they're like, sure enough, we didn't have the budget, we didn't have enough servers, and then triple the size of the server farm with no concern that that might have been overkill, but then they're not going to get paged again, but then the business is paying the price with every monthly bill that happens. So if you think about all of those things, if all those things are in proper order, the errors are not happening and it's responsive and it's available and all this, you're generally providing a pretty good customer experience.
That makes sense. Lee?
Yeah, so certainly when I joined Amazon retail, latency was king. Everything was about latency because there was a well-known data point that this is very early in the days of the commercial internet, so to speak, and there was a very clear correlation that occurred that as latency in a page load went up, the revenue from that page dropped. And it was very, very clear. Amazon had tons of data that supported that. And so latency was everything. A page that slowed down by 5% meant we had 5% less revenue. It wasn't quite non-linear, but you get the idea. And so those things were taken very seriously. So latency was really king in the early days of Amazon. Interestingly, traffic and errors, of course, were also issues. But interestingly, we ran into the same sort of scenario that Jim was alluding to. Saturation was never a problem with Amazon because Amazon was always growing, so always adding resources and always over provisioning in order to handle those extra resources. So in the early days, when you have easy to provision resources, which was a brand new concept back then. This was before AWS really started, but we had an internal AWS type system that did the same sort of provisioning. But if you have easy to provision resources and team level ownership of the resource demands, you tended to get over provisioning rather easily because as Jim says, it's less costly to allocate more than you need than it is to run out of resources. So we never had a saturation issue until cost started becoming a real issue. And I think we're going to talk more about costs later on. Hopefully we are anyway, not maybe in a future webinar, but cloud costs are a major problem that has come out of that mindset. But that mindset really was prevalent at Amazon and at other places as well. You just over provision and the problem goes away.
Yeah, we're having good discussions. We've got two questions in here. So one is from Gopal. The answer is that for inadequate data, it's not always more data, and is more data an operational hazard? So I'll take a shot and then welcome everybody else. What I always like to think about, definitely too much data is a hazard, especially the higher up in the organization. I always think about we need to look at the key things that drive outcomes versus everything. And one easy way from my perspective is, hey, this thing, if we measure it, and whether it's good or bad, is that going to influence our behaviors? If regardless of the results, we're not going to do anything with it, then I say it probably has very little usage. That's a really great way to do it. We just talked about the four golden signals, which are kind of some key things to look at. Jim Lee, you want to add anything on that one?
Ken, you nailed it. And then I think the operational hazard, if you have too many things, starts to become each thing is less obvious or less looked at. So that's why the goal, like a set of golden things, we think it's those metrics, but depending on your situation, it may be others. But once you get 10 things, 20 things to look at, it dilutes your focus. It's just a natural human focus problem. So focusing in just on the things that are the most important that you would take action on, I think is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I read something of many years ago about the maximum number of things a human can pay attention to is seven. at a time. I'm not sure where that data came from, but it was the idea of 7 different things you can focus on. And so you certainly don't want to have more than 7 different, you know, there is no 8 golden signals. There's 4 golden signals. You want to have less is more when it comes to data. I think that the thing you really want to understand is that more data is not better; it's worse. The right data is what you need.
Makes sense. And we got another question. What can you say about from Philip about creating a culture that's focused on customer outcomes and how incidents oppose positive outcomes for the customer? So I would say a culture of positive outcomes, I think almost starts even at the product level. We're going to build this thing that's really valuable for our customers because it's going to benefit them or the company, hopefully both, in this way. And that's why we're going to build it. And so we have a hypothesis on utilization, adoption, and so forth. The amount of features that sit behind feature flag requests for one customer it's turned on. I mean, there's billions and billions of dollars spent on that or features that no one really used because they were never measured. So I think if you're doing a full culture, I would say it probably starts with when you build the thing in the first place, and then just prioritizing it. So it goes back to if you have a good process, is when something breaks, that work needs to get prioritized. So if you build a process that say, hey, we break this, that was a P1, P2, whatever incident, which corresponds to this SLA on the action items, then that needs to take precedence over feature work. Because sometimes you've seen it where, the engineering team's forced to be a feature factory and they're not paying attention to the care and feeding. And effectively, all you do is slow down the factory of engineering over time. That's my 2 cents. Again, Jim, Lee, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that, in Amazon, they've famously been known for their customer obsession focus. And I can tell you, especially in the early days of Amazon, that most certainly was true. And that I think that customer obsession is one of the core reasons why they grew as fast as they did, and why they became such a centralized commodity as what they are. It's not just doing what the customer needs or the customer wants. It's being obsessed with what the customers want to do. And that's taken all the way through the organization, not just in the product part, part of the company. I think you need that sort of mindset in order to make the right decisions about what to do with a product. And sometimes making a decision for a customer may seem like the wrong business decision, but I think the idea is eventually by focusing just on what the customers want, the business comes around. And I think the same thing's true with product issues as well.
Philip
Can
made a
I,
good point. Lee made. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
I was going to jump in on this one. So, if you've happened to work for Amazon, Lee, you're fortunate in that it has an entire culture already built up around
Yeah.
this. I think probably people on this webinar today are like, hey, I would like us to do better as a company with reliability. How do I do it? And so if you find yourself, I think it was Philip that asked this question. If you find yourself unable to make, if you're not the CEO, it's like, what do you do? You need to find practical strategies for basically starting to make this cultural shift, right? So one of the things I can tell you is there are other groups within your company that are probably far more interested in the customer happiness than the engineering team. And those other groups within the company can be advocates for you to maybe push through larger organizational changes around looking at this information. So go find advocates who also believe like you do that this is important, and you basically need to build up, some momentum in order to, affect a cultural change. Because you're going to want to start showing data in different meetings. You're going to want maybe an email goes out every week with all this information in it that people never used to see, and that's scary because it's like, well, now there's transparency, but you basically need ways to engineer the cultural shift that you've identified is a problem. And no matter what your role is, if you're an IC, if you're a mid-level leader, if you're a senior level leader, even if you're a CEO, you may have all these same questions. How do I affect a cultural change? And you do need to sit down and basically create a strategy of, okay, well, if we did these things more often, it would probably drive the behaviors that I'm looking for. So again, just some practical advice. No matter where you sit in an organization, you're going to have to come up and have a strategy for how you're going to implement that cultural change.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I thank all the participants. We've got some, we're going to go to a lightning round. So hopefully you'll like these questions. And Jim and Lee, and I'll put myself on the spot too. So what I'm going to do is just give a question and rotate it out. So that way we kind of get as much as we can content for everybody. Jim, I'm going to give you this one. I think this is a common, battle when you're trying to focus on reliability. How can people effectively balance reliability and innovation? Because let's face it, product engineering, sales are like, more features, more
Yeah.
functionality, how do you do that?
Yeah. I have a simple rubric, which is reliability always has to come first. Not you're never going to fix or you're never going to protect against every outage, but you just have to make that always the top priority. And eventually, when you do that, you'll fix issues, the site will stabilize, and then you can focus on the new product development. They're really hard, I think, to balance. It's easier to say, like, look, we obviously want to always build new features, but when there's reliability problems organizationally, we swarm on that, we take care of it, and we really make sure they don't repeat. I can tell you from experience that will eventually get you fantastic throughput on the innovation and on the new feature side. Because your teams, when they get interrupted all the time from incidents, that's what tanks their velocity on feature development. It's like a hidden cost is their feature velocity tanks.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the other part is the hidden costs outside of even the team and reliability. A lot of people are like, I got to push this feature. Well, how much are we going to sell? 50,000. Well, that outage just cost us 2 million. you know, so let's think about that. All right, Liam, I'll put you on the spot. Hopefully it's okay. And again, if you could just make it as short as answer as possible. What are the best practices for automating incident response and root cause analysis? That's an easy one to do a short answer
Blameless.
on.
No, it seriously, it's creating standardized, repeatable processes that get to root cause in every incident and communicates all of the necessary information that's important to the right stakeholders. And that's really the core.
Yeah, I'm going to go to the next question in a second, but just real quick, one of the things we wanted to do is share with everybody, especially all of you that are sticking through us with as we go through it, is as white papers. Nothing like listening to customers. We recently added a company called Bamboo HR, and they share kind of their journey and their story. So, Aaron, if you could just post a link, just you can download it easily, a white paper on just how they're taking on kind of incident management and putting practices around that kind of that journey. So hopefully that might be some documents that will help you. And we've got some other interesting ones coming out with MyFitnessPal. So stay tuned. We'll have some other things that we'll release. All right, go to the next one. How can we measure and improve the performance of our systems beyond basic uptime metrics? Jim, I think you kind of hit on that. Anything you want to add to it?
Well, basic uptime, let's say, call it, other than the golden signals. So you got your uptime, your latency, and all that. You want to really measure the impact of incidents. How long were the incidents? How many team members got involved? How expensive was it to be? If you're in reactionary, so incident's an unplanned thing and you're reacting to it, and just trying to measure the cost of that reaction, and maybe even put like a dollar value on it. You're collecting some extra information about it. So there's there's measuring for observing your systems, and there's measuring the impact of the outages. If you don't know the impact of the outages, there's no incentive to fix it. If you can measure at least some of the impact of these things, even just frequency on it, like how many incidents are you having, what duration were the incidents, and what parts of the system, and what was the business cost, dollars or whatever. Otherwise, that's a really great place to measure next. Then you got visibility into this whole thing that typically you don't have a lot of visibility into.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Um, how can a company build a sustainable SRE DevOps culture within its organization? How do you build it sustainable? Because sometimes we've seen people where they get really excited, they build in a great SRE practice, and then over time, like it starts to almost look like the old ops engineering, they kind of go backwards. Lee, any thoughts for that?
So I'm always a big fan on single ownership. So even if you using the SRE mindset, I still like the idea of having individual teams that own everything having to do with a particular service or a system within the application. So that's the development, it's the operation, it's the support, it's the reliability, all of it under a single team's umbrella. Now, some of those things they're going to be able to do natively, and some of it may be new to them and not things they're used to. If they're primarily a development team, they're not going to know the operations aspect. Primarily operations team, they're not going to know the development aspects. But what I recommend then is horizontal support teams that help you provide what it takes to make those teams successful. So ownership with the individual teams, support teams that help those owners accomplish their goals, but single point ownership on all aspects, development, operations, service, everything.
Great. I also made a hand raise. If you could just put the question in Q&A, we'd be happy to answer it for you. All right, we're going to try to see if we could jam in two last questions, and we're going to wrap up. This has been a great session. Jim, I'm going to give you this one. How can you bridge the communications gap between development and operational teams?
Well, okay, so communications in general can be tricky. Between operations teams and development teams, usually they've got to know each other. They're on friendly terms. They're in Slack. Maybe there's meetings. If your organization's big enough where they're two separate groups, and if they're at war with each other, then you have a cultural problem, right? And you want to get them working well together. I know what you've done in the past is you embed some operations people within the development teams. So if that's, if you have a separate ops group, you got to embed. And that way, there's relationships that form and then the barriers kind of come down. And there's also communications outside, like during an incident. The best practice there is make sure you assign someone the communications lead. And so they're communicating maybe internally when there's an outage, that could be the incident commander, another role that you can assign, or maybe if it's external communications, again, someone's assigned to lead that. So again, you need to have that as part of your incident response process.
All right, and I'm going to wrap it up with the last question I'll ask myself. One of the times in operations, a lot of times we know it's inefficient to have poor tooling. It's inefficient for engineering to do, low value work. It's inefficient for outages to happen in the first place, right? Because we underinvested or whatever it may be. But, oftentimes people don't know how to put a business case around what is that cost of inefficiency. And it's actually more than that. Like, there's the cost to your brand. There's the cost of just inconsistencies. You think about if it's a larger organization, you have an outage or even intermittent performance issues. Well, guess what? Those are the engineering team's not hearing. Your customer success or support division's hearing all of those things, and they're not able to replicate them. So one of the things we've done is, I think we used to call it the ROI calculator. We call it the incident calculator. Just gives you an idea. You can fill out some things. It gives you a preview, and you just click submit, and it gives you a bunch of other data to think about the beginnings of how do you make a business case around improving the incident management process? Because, obviously Blameless, we have tooling that really helps automate all of that. But there's a big process, but the first part is really understanding the cost. So we'll put Aaron, if you could put the ROI calculator in there one more time. And again, we also have, a special bonus, the Bamboo HR white paper that hopefully that gives you some value. Feel free to, whether it be Lee, myself, or Jim, you could send us a message on LinkedIn. We love to help and kind of give back to the community. If there's any things we could do that. Of course, if you know anybody that might be interested in Blameless, please send us them our way. We really want to thank you. And I just want to do a quick preview. I think, Lee, we've got another webinar that you're going to be hosting. You also host, what was that, the engineering podcast, Lee, I think you host also.
Software Engineering Daily. I'm one of the
Yeah,
hosts on that.
I remember so
A
many
lot of you,
people
I'm
like
sure, have
from years
watched
ago
that.
had reached out to me when you and I did that. So
Yeah.
Lee, you're going to have a special guest. You're going to be on Blameless, I think on the 30th, and you're going to have a special guest, one of our customers, so interactive with them, right?
That's correct. I can't tell you who that guest is yet, but as soon as we're able to give you that information, we'll make sure that's publicly available. But join me as I interview them on, I believe it's January 30th.
Yep.
Aaron, correct me if that's wrong, but I believe it's January 30th.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks everybody. This is a great session. Good questions. Next time you see when we're going to do more of these type of things, because one of the things that gets us excited is really just helping, giving back to the community. So really, thank you for participating. Thank you for your time, and have a great Tuesday. And thanks, Nader.
Thank you.